The blood on Colt Brennan's hands had barely dried when the dog found him, a half-wild creature with eyes like amber glass and scars that told stories no animal should have to carry. The year was 1877, and the Arizona Territory stretched out before them, both like a promise waiting to be broken. All red dust and desperate hope under a sun that seemed to punish the very earth itself. Colt had been tracking rustlers for 3 days through the Superstition Mountains when he stumbled across the animal caught in a rusted trap, its leg mangled and its spirit still fighting, despite the pain that must have been tearing through its body. He had approached slowly, speaking in the low, steady voice his father had taught him before consumption took the old man's 6 winters back. The dog had snapped and snarled, foam gathering at the corners of its mouth, but Colt saw past the aggression to the terror underneath. He had spent an hour talking to that dog before he could get close enough to spring the trap, and when he finally did, the animal had limped away into the brush without so much as a backward glance. Colt figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. The dog showed up at his camp that night, keeping to the shadows beyond the firelight. Colt tossed it some jerky and pretended not to notice when the food disappeared. This went on for weeks, the dog following at a distance as Colt made his way back to Tombstone, never getting close enough to touch, but never straying far either. By the time they reached the dusty streets of the mining town, Colt had given up trying to send the animal away. He named him Ghost, partly for the way he moved like smoke through the darkness, and partly because the dog seemed to be haunted by whatever had happened before they met. Ghost trusted exactly one person in this world, and that was Colt. When other men approached, the dog would bare its teeth and emit a growl that came from somewhere deep and primal. Women fared no better. Children learned quickly to give Ghost wide berth. The dog would tolerate no hand but Colt's, would accept food from no other source, would sleep nowhere except within sight of his master. Colt had tried to socialize the animal, but after Ghost nearly tore the arm off a drunk who stumbled too close one night outside the Oriental Saloon, he stopped trying. Ghost was what he was, and Colt accepted that the way he accepted most things in his life, with quiet resignation and the understanding that some wounds went too deep to ever fully heal. Colt worked odd jobs around Tombstone, enough to keep himself fed and sheltered. He was good with horses, better with a gun, and best at keeping his mouth shut when wise men would have spoken. At 26 years old, he had seen enough of life's cruelties to know that the world was not fair, and that justice was a commodity rarer than gold in these territories. He kept to himself mostly, spending his evenings at the boarding house where he rented a small room. Ghost curled on the floor beside his bed, those amber eyes watching the door, as if expecting danger to come crashing through at any moment. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when everything changed. Colt had been hired to break a string of horses for a rancher named McKinnon, and he was leading one of the gentler mares through town when he heard the commotion. A crowd had gathered near the Wells Fargo office, and the sound of raised voices carried across the dusty street. He normally would have kept walking, but Ghost's ears had perked forward, and something in the dog's posture made Colt pause. A woman stood in the center of the crowd, and even from a distance, Colt could see she was in trouble. She wore a traveling dress that had once been fine, but now bore the dust and wrinkles of a long journey. Her dark hair had come partially loose from its pins, falling in waves around her face, and she held a carpet bag clutched against her chest like a shield. 3 men surrounded her, and their intentions were clear enough even if their words did not carry. Colt felt Ghost tense beside him, and he put a hand on the dog's head without thinking. "Easy," he murmured. The woman's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. "I have explained this twice already. The ticket was purchased in St. Louis, and the stage line assured me that my trunk would arrive within the week. I am simply inquiring as to its whereabouts." One of the men, a tall fellow with a tobacco-stained beard, laughed. "And I am simply inquiring as to whether a lady traveling alone might be interested in some company. This is rough country, miss. A woman without protection is liable to find herself in all sorts of trouble. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Thank you." The woman's tone was ice, but Colt could hear the tremor underneath. She was afraid, and doing her best not to show it. "Now, that is where you are mistaken." The bearded man reached out and grabbed her arm. "A woman alone does not understand the dangers that—" He never finished the sentence. Ghost was moving before Colt could stop him, a blur of gray fur and fury that crossed the street in heartbeats. The dog did not attack, did not bite, but he placed himself between the woman and the man with such sudden violence that everyone took a step back. The growl that emerged from Ghost's throat was something primordial, a sound that spoke of wolves and wild places and things that hunted in the dark. The bearded man released the woman's arm and reached for his gun. Colt was already moving, dropping the mare's reins and stepping into the space between Ghost and the drawn weapon. "I would not do that if I were you," he said quietly. The man's eyes flicked from Colt to the dog and back again. "You need to control your animal, friend." "He is controlled." Colt's hand rested casually near his own pistol, and the gesture was not lost on anyone present. "The lady said she was not interested in your company. Seems to me that should have been the end of the conversation." For a moment, the street was silent, except for the wind rustling through the wooden awnings and the distant sound of a piano from one of the saloons. Then the bearded man spat into the dust and turned away, his companions following. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over for the moment. Colt turned to the woman and started to apologize, but the words died on his lips. She was looking at Ghost, and the dog was looking back at her, and something was happening that Colt could not quite understand. Ghost's ears had come forward, curious rather than aggressive, and his tail gave a tentative wag. The woman slowly crouched down, setting her carpetbag aside, and extended one hand palm up in a gesture of peace. "Hello there," she said softly. "You are quite the protector, are you not?" Ghost took a step forward, then another. He stretched his neck out and sniffed her hand, and then, before Colt could process what he was seeing, the dog licked her fingers. Not once, but twice, and then he was pressing his head against her palm, accepting her touch as if he had known her all his life. Colt felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he could not name. "I will be damned," he whispered. The woman looked up at him, and he saw that her eyes were green, the color of new leaves in spring. "Is he yours?" "He is. His name is Ghost." Colt found himself moving closer, drawn by something he could not explain. "And he does not like people. Never has. I have had him near 8 months now, and you are the first person he has let touch him besides me." She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Then I suppose I should be honored." She continued to stroke Ghost's head, and the dog leaned into her touch with something that looked almost like contentment. "I am Eleanor Bishop, formerly of St. Louis, currently of nowhere in particular. Colt Brennan. I would say welcome to Tombstone, but I am not sure that would be entirely honest. This is not the friendliest town for a woman traveling alone." Eleanor stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "So, I am discovering. I had hoped to connect with my cousin here. She married a mining engineer last year and wrote to tell me there were opportunities for educated women in the territory. Teaching positions primarily." Her expression clouded. "However, the letter I received 2 weeks ago informed me that she and her husband had relocated to California. By the time I received the news, I had already sold my possessions and purchased my ticket west." "So you came anyway?" "I had nothing to return to." She said it simply, as a statement of fact, rather than a plea for sympathy. "My parents passed within months of each other last winter. The house had to be sold to settle debts. I have a teaching certificate and $47 to my name, and I decided that starting fresh in Arizona territory seemed as reasonable as starting fresh anywhere else." Colt studied her for a long moment. She could not have been more than 23 or 24, young enough that the world had not yet beaten all the hope out of her, but old enough to understand that life rarely went according to plan. There was intelligence in her eyes and steel in her spine, and Ghost sat at her feet as if he had been waiting his whole life for her to arrive. "The schoolhouse here has a teacher already," Colt said slowly, "but I heard tell that the settlement at Dos Rios is looking for someone. It is about 20 miles northeast of here, up in the high country. Smaller than Tombstone, but growing. Lots of families moving in to work the silver claims. 20 miles is not so far." Eleanor bent to pick up her carpetbag, and Ghost immediately moved to her side. "Though I confess I am not certain how to arrange transportation, or where I might stay until I can make inquiries." Colt made a decision that he suspected was either very wise or very foolish, and he would not know which until much later. "The boarding house where I stay has rooms available. Mrs. Chen, who runs it, is honest and charges fair prices. I could introduce you if you like. And tomorrow, if you still want to go to Dos Rios, I could take you. I have business up that way regardless." This was not entirely true, but it was not entirely false either. Colt had been meaning to check on a string of horses he had sold to a rancher near Dos Rios, and tomorrow was as good a day as any to make the trip. Eleanor looked at him with those green eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see straight through him. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Brennan. I accept, provided you allow me to pay you for your time and trouble." "There is no need for that." "There is every need. I will not begin my new life as a charity case." Her tone left no room for argument. Colt nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Let me collect that mare before she wanders off, and we will get you settled." They walked together through the streets of Tombstone, Ghost trotting between them like he had appointed himself guardian to them both. Colt found himself hyper-aware of Eleanor's presence beside him, the rustle of her skirts and the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite the dust of travel. She asked him questions about the town, about the territory, about his work, and he answered as best he could, surprised to find that conversation came easily, despite his usual reticence. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a whitewashed adobe structure at the edge of town, clean and well-maintained. The proprietress was a Chinese woman who had come west with her husband during the gold rush and stayed after he died of cholera. She spoke English with a heavy accent but understood it perfectly, and she ran her establishment with an iron hand wrapped in courtesy. She took one look at Eleanor, quoted a price that was reasonable, and showed her to a small room on the second floor that had a window overlooking the street. "Dinner is at 6, Mrs. Chen said. "No men in the rooms, no drinking, no fighting. You break something, you pay for it. You pay each Friday for the week ahead. You understand?" "Perfectly." Eleanor set her carpetbag on the narrow bed. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen." After the proprietress left, Eleanor turned to Colt with a wry smile. "I like her. Most people do, once they realize arguing with her is pointless." Colt hesitated in the doorway, aware that he should leave, but reluctant to go. Ghost had planted himself at Eleanor's feet again, and the sight of the dog so completely at ease with this stranger was still unsettling. "I will come by tomorrow morning, around 7 if that suits you. Wear something practical if you have it. The ride to Dos Rios is not difficult, but it is dusty." 7 is fine. "And Mr. Brennan?" Eleanor crossed to where he stood and extended her hand. "Thank you. You did not have to help me today, but you did. That means something." Colt took her hand, and the touch sent an unexpected jolt through him. Her fingers were slim and strong, uncalloused but not soft. Anyone would have done the same. But they did not. You did. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then released his hand. "I will see you in the morning." Colt walked back to his own room in a daze, Ghost following reluctantly at his heels. The dog kept looking back toward Eleanor's door, whining softly, and Colt understood the feeling. There was something about her, something that pulled at him in a way he had not experienced before. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she was. It was the way she had faced down those men without flinching, the way she had spoken of her circumstances without self-pity, the way Ghost had responded to her like she was someone worth trusting. That night, Colt lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around him. Ghost was restless, pacing from the door to the window and back again. And finally, Colt gave up trying to sleep. He rose and dressed and slipped quietly out into the night, the dog at his heels. Tombstone never truly slept. The saloons and gambling houses stayed open until dawn, and the streets were alive with miners and cowboys and men looking for trouble or running from it. Colt walked to the edge of town, to the place where the buildings gave way to open desert, and stood looking out at the darkness. The stars overhead were brilliant and cold, and the wind carried the scent of sage and creosote. He thought about Eleanor Bishop, about the trust in Ghost's eyes when he looked at her, about the way his own heart had quickened when she smiled. Colt had not allowed himself to feel anything for anyone in a long time. After what happened to Sarah, after the fever took her and their unborn child, he had locked that part of himself away. It was easier to be alone, safer to feel nothing, simpler to drift through life without forming attachments that could be ripped away. But Ghost had trusted Eleanor, and Ghost never trusted anyone. Maybe that meant something. Maybe that meant she was different. Maybe that meant Colt could risk opening that locked door, just a crack, and see what happened. He stood there for a long time, until the sky began to lighten in the east and the stars faded one by one. Then he turned and walked back to the boarding house, Ghost trotting beside him, and tried to convince himself that tomorrow was just another day and Eleanor was just another person passing through his life. He failed. Morning came bright and clear, the September sun already warming the air by the time Colt knocked on Eleanor's door at 7. She answered immediately, dressed in a simpler outfit than she had worn the day before, a split riding skirt and a cotton blouse that made her look younger and more vulnerable. Her hair was braided and pinned up, and she carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. "I am ready," she announced. They walked to the livery stable where Colt kept his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Sage. He saddled the horse and helped Eleanor mount, aware of the warmth of her waist under his hands, the way she did not flinch from the contact. He swung up behind her, settling into the saddle with Ghost trotting alongside, and they set off into the desert. The ride to Dos Rios took them through spectacular country, climbing gradually from the low desert into rolling grasslands dotted with juniper and oak. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, and the harsh reds and browns of the Sonoran Desert gave way to gentler golds and greens. Eleanor asked questions constantly, wanting to know the names of plants and birds, the history of the region, the stories behind the landmarks they passed. Colt found himself talking more than he had in months, drawn out by her genuine curiosity and quick intelligence. "How did you come to be in Arizona territory?" Eleanor asked as they paused to water Sage at a small creek. "I was born here. Well, not here exactly. My father had a ranch about 40 miles south of Tombstone, near the border. Small operation, just enough cattle to keep us fed. He died when I was 20, and I sold the place to pay off his debts. Been drifting since then, picking up work where I can find it." "Do you miss it, having a place of your own?" Colt considered the question. "Sometimes. But running a ranch alone is hard work, and there are too many memories there. Some places are better left in the past." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and then she said softly, "I understand that. I sold my parents' house without ever going back inside after the funeral. I could not bear to walk through those rooms knowing they would never be there again." He looked at her, this woman he barely knew, and felt a connection snap into place between them. They were both running from ghosts, both trying to build new lives on the ruins of old ones. Maybe that was why Ghost trusted her. Maybe the dog recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to be wounded and wary, and still somehow keep moving forward. They reached Dos Rios just after noon. The settlement was smaller than Tombstone, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a central square, where a fountain bubbled with water from the nearby river. The mountains rose blue and hazy in the distance, and the air smelled of pine and possibility. Colt asked around and learned that the man to speak with about the teaching position was the mayor, a former lawyer named Caleb Wright, who ran the general store. Wright was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked Eleanor up and down with a skeptical expression that Colt immediately disliked. "You are awfully young to be a teacher." "I am 23 years old and hold a certificate from the Missouri State Normal School," Eleanor replied coolly. "I have been teaching for 4 years, including 2 years as the head teacher at a school in St. Louis, with an enrollment of 40 students. I can provide references if required." Wright's expression shifted slightly. "References from St. Louis would not do me much good out here, but we are desperate for someone qualified. Our last teacher left to get married, and the children have been without proper schooling for near 3 months now." He named a salary that was modest but fair, and explained that the job came with a small house behind the schoolhouse. "Can you start Monday?" Eleanor glanced at Colt, and he saw the hope and fear warring in her eyes. He gave a tiny nod, and she turned back to Wright. Yes, I can start Monday." They spent the rest of the afternoon making arrangements. Eleanor signed the necessary papers, received the key to her new house, and purchased supplies from Wright's store. The house was tiny, just 2 rooms and a kitchen with a fireplace, but it was clean and sturdy and came furnished with the basics. Eleanor stood in the center of the main room and turned in a slow circle, and when she looked at Colt, there were tears in her eyes. "I have a home," she whispered. "I have a job and a home. I cannot believe this is real." Colt wanted to cross the room and pull her into his arms, but he kept his distance, unsure of his welcome. "You earned it. You did this yourself. I would not be here without you." She brushed at her eyes impatiently. "You helped me when you had no reason to. You brought me here when you could have just given me directions. Why? It was a fair question, and Colt did not have a good answer. Or rather, he had an answer, but he was not ready to speak it aloud. Ghost trusts you, he said instead. That is reason enough. They rode back to Tombstone in the golden light of late afternoon, and this time Eleanor leaned back against Colt's chest, her body warm and solid against his. Ghost ranged ahead of them on the trail, pausing occasionally to look back and make sure they were following. The sun painted the landscape in shades of amber and rose, and Colt felt something he had not experienced in 3 years, something dangerous and terrifying and wonderful. He felt hope. Over the next week, Colt found himself spending more time in Eleanor's company than good sense dictated. He helped her move her few belongings from the boarding house to Dos Rios, making 3 trips in total to transport everything she would need. He introduced her to people he knew in the settlement, vouching for her character and ensuring that she would be treated with respect. He repaired a broken window in her house and fixed the latch on her door, and spent an entire day helping her prepare the schoolhouse for the arrival of her students. Eleanor was a force of nature when focused on a task. She swept and scrubbed and organized with relentless efficiency, transforming the dusty one-room schoolhouse into a space that felt warm and welcoming. She arranged the desks in neat rows, hung maps and slates on the walls, and created a small reading corner with cushions and a bookshelf. Colt found himself content just to be near her, to listen to her talk about lesson plans and teaching methods, to watch the way her face lit up when she spoke about her students. Ghost was never far from Eleanor's side. The dog had apparently decided that his primary purpose in life was now to protect this woman, and he took the job seriously. When Colt had to return to Tombstone for work, Ghost refused to go with him, choosing instead to stay with Eleanor. Colt told himself he was not jealous of a dog, but he was lying. On Friday evening, after Eleanor's first week of teaching was complete, Colt arrived at her house to find her sitting on the front step, Ghost's head in her lap. She looked exhausted but happy, and when she saw him, her smile made his heart skip. "How was it?" he asked, settling onto the step beside her. "Wonderful, terrifying, exhausting, perfect," she laughed. "I have 18 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Some of them can barely read, and others are doing mathematics that would challenge students twice their age. It is going to be an incredible challenge, but I already love them. They are lucky to have you. I am lucky to have them." She turned to look at him, and the setting sun caught in her eyes, turning them to emerald. "Colt, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." His chest tightened. "All right. You have been unfailingly kind to me since the moment we met. You have asked nothing in return, and you have given me more help than I had any right to expect. But I need to know what this is. Are you being kind because you feel sorry for me? Because you think I need protecting? Or is there something more?" She took a breath. "Because I need to tell you that there is something more for me. I think about you constantly. When you are not here, I find myself listening for your footsteps. When you are here, I do not want you to leave. And if this is one-sided, I need to know now so that I can protect my heart before it is too late." Colt sat frozen, her words echoing in his mind. He thought about Sarah, about the promise he had made to himself never to love again, never to risk that kind of pain. And then he looked at Eleanor, brave and vulnerable and beautiful in the dying light, and he knew that the choice had already been made. Somewhere between Ghost's first wag of his tail and this moment, Colt had fallen completely and irreversibly in love. "It is not one-sided," he said, his voice rough. "I have been trying to fight it because I am terrified. The last woman I loved died, and I swore I would never put myself through that again. But, Eleanor, I think about you every waking moment. I invent reasons to see you. I volunteer for tasks I do not want to do just so I can spend time in your company. And when Ghost chose you, when he trusted you after months of trusting no one, I knew you were special. I knew you were different. I knew I was in trouble. And now," her voice was barely a whisper, "now I am done fighting it." He reached out and cupped her face in his palm, feeling her lean into his touch. "If you will have me, I am yours. I do not have much to offer. I live day to day, job to job. But I will work hard, and I will do right by you, and I will love you with everything I have." Eleanor turned her face and kissed his palm. "That is all I need. That is everything I want." He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. Her lips were warm and sweet, and the feeling of her in his arms was like coming home after a long journey. Ghost made a contented sound and settled at their feet, and above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. They sat on that step long into the evening, talking about the past and the future, about dreams and fears, and all the things that had led them to this moment. Eleanor told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her father's bookshop and her mother's garden, about the fever that took them both within 3 months. Colt told her about the ranch, about his father's long decline, about Sarah and the baby that never drew breath. The words came easier than he expected, the old pain less sharp in the sharing of it. "I do not want to replace her," Eleanor said softly. "I want you to know that. What you had with her was real and important, and I would never ask you to forget it. You are not replacing anyone. You are something entirely new." Colt pulled her closer. "Sarah was my first love, and I will always carry her memory. But you are my second chance, Eleanor. You are proof that life goes on, that there is still joy to be found even after sorrow, and I do not want to waste another moment of it." In the weeks that followed, they built a life together, with the kind of quiet determination that defines the best relationships. Colt took on more regular work, hiring himself out to local ranchers and earning a steady wage for the first time in years. He was good with horses and better with people than he gave himself credit for, and word spread that Colt Brennan was reliable and honest. The jobs came more frequently, and the pay improved. He spent his evenings in Dos Rios, helping Eleanor with chores around her house, sitting in on her classes to watch her teach, walking with her through the settlement as Ghost trotted happily between them. They became a familiar sight. The teacher and the cowboy, and the dog that trusted no one but them, and the people of Dos Rios accepted them as a unit. Eleanor thrived in her role as teacher. Her students adored her, and their parents respected her dedication and skill. She organized spelling bees and recitals, started a small lending library using her own books and donations from families, and somehow found time to tutor the older students who wanted to continue their education beyond the basics. She was tireless and passionate, and watching her work filled Colt with a pride he could barely express. In November, as the weather turned cool and the mountains to the north received their first dusting of snow, Colt made a decision. He had been saving money carefully, spending as little as possible and putting aside every extra dollar. He rode to Tombstone and visited the small jewelry shop run by a German craftsman named Hoffman, and there he purchased a simple gold band set with a small turquoise stone. It cost him nearly everything he had saved, but when Hoffman placed the ring in his palm, Colt knew it was perfect. The turquoise was the color of the Arizona sky, and Eleanor had mentioned once that it was her favorite stone. He proposed on a Saturday evening in early December, after a week of cold rain that had turned the roads to mud and kept everyone indoors. The storm had finally broken, and the sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. They were at Eleanor's house, sitting before the fire, and Ghost was asleep on the hearth. Colt had been trying to find the right words all evening, but finally he just pulled the ring from his pocket and held it out to her. "I know we have only known each other a few months," he said, "and I know I'm not much of a catch, but I love you, Eleanor Bishop. I love your courage and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to accept defeat. I love the way you talk to your students and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes and the way you look in the morning with your hair all loose. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy if you will let me. Will you marry me?" Eleanor stared at the ring, and for a terrible moment, Colt thought she was going to refuse. Then she looked up at him, with tears streaming down her face, and nodded. "Yes. Yes, of course, yes. I love you too, Colt Brennan. I love your gentleness and your strength and the way you care for things without ever asking for credit. I love how patient you are with Ghost and how hard you work and the way you listen when I talk about my day. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, and yes, and yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. And then they were kissing and laughing and crying all at once. Ghost woke up and barked, confused by the commotion, and that made them laugh harder. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, deciding that they would marry in the spring when the weather improved, that they would build a house of their own on land. Colt had been eyeing near Dos Rios, that they would fill it with children and love and all the things that make a life worth living. That night, Colt walked back to Tombstone under a sky full of stars, and his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He had found something he thought was lost forever, something precious and rare and worth fighting for. He had found love again, and this time, he was not going to let fear stop him from embracing it fully. Winter in the Arizona high country was mild compared to what Eleanor had known in Missouri, but it still brought cold nights and occasional snow. Colt found work where he could, sometimes traveling for days to help with cattle drives or horse breaking. But he always came back to Dos Rios, always came back to Eleanor. She kept teaching through the winter months, and her little house became a gathering place for the community. She hosted dinners for her students' families, organized holiday celebrations, and somehow made everyone feel welcome in her small space. They set a date for the wedding, the first Saturday in May, and planned a simple ceremony in the schoolhouse followed by a reception in the town square. Eleanor sewed her own dress, working on it by lamplight in the evenings, and Colt commissioned a local carpenter to build them a bed and a kitchen table. They chose a plot of land on the outskirts of Dos Rios, 5 acres with a creek running through it and a view of the mountains, and Colt began the slow process of clearing the site and gathering materials for their house. In February, a crisis struck that tested everything they had built together. A fever swept through Dos Rios, affecting mostly the children, and Eleanor's schoolhouse became an impromptu infirmary. She moved between 6 students with tireless energy, cooling foreheads with damp cloths, spooning medicine into unwilling mouths, comforting frightened parents. Colt worked alongside her, fetching water and firewood, riding to Tombstone for supplies, doing whatever needed to be done. For 3 weeks, the outcome hung in the balance. Several children became dangerously ill, including a 6-year-old girl named Lily, who was Eleanor's youngest student. Colt watched Eleanor fight for these children with the same determination she brought to everything, refusing to accept that they might lose even one. And slowly, miraculously, the tide turned. The fever broke, the children began to recover, and life returned to something approaching normal. But the experience left its mark on both of them. One night, after the last sick child had been returned to their family and the schoolhouse had been scrubbed clean, Eleanor broke down in Colt's arms. "I was so afraid," she sobbed. "I kept thinking about your Sarah, about the fever that took your family, and I was terrified it was going to happen again. I was afraid I would lose these children, and I was afraid that even if we saved them, you would leave because the memories were too painful." Colt held her close, stroking her hair. "I am not going anywhere. Yes, it was hard. Yes, there were moments when the memories nearly overwhelmed me. But Eleanor, you are not Sarah, and these children are not the child I lost. This is our life, our story, and it does not have to end the way that one did. We saved them. You saved them. And I am more proud of you than I can possibly express." She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I love you. I love you too. And in 3 months, we are getting married, and we are going to build a life together, and we are going to fill it with so much happiness that the shadows of the past cannot touch us." Spring came to Arizona with an explosion of color. The desert bloomed with wildflowers, painting the landscape in brilliant reds and yellows and purples. The creek on their land swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, and the air was sweet with the scent of new growth. Colt worked from dawn to dusk on their house, determined to have it finished before the wedding. Friends and neighbors pitched in to help, and the structure rose quickly, a simple adobe home with thick walls and a wide porch facing the mountains. Eleanor threw herself into wedding preparations with the same energy she brought to teaching. She worked with the women of Dos Rios to plan the reception, organizing food and decorations and music. Colt watched her transform the town square into something magical, hanging paper lanterns from the trees and arranging borrowed tables and chairs into welcoming clusters. She was in her element, bringing people together and creating something beautiful out of nothing. The night before the wedding, Colt stood on the porch of their nearly finished house and looked out at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. Ghost sat beside him, the dog's presence a solid comfort. Colt thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the grief-stricken man who had stumbled across an injured dog in the Superstition Mountains to the man he was now, ready to start a new chapter with a woman who had changed everything. "You knew," he said to Ghost. "You knew she was special before I did. Thank you for that." Ghost thumped his tail against the porch boards and leaned into Colt's leg, and that was answer enough. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for an outdoor celebration. Eleanor looked breathtaking in her simple white dress, her dark hair crowned with wildflowers, her green eyes bright with joy. Colt wore his best clothes, a new white shirt and black vest and trousers, his boots polished until they shone. Ghost wore a ribbon around his neck, blue to match the turquoise in Eleanor's ring, and took his role as witness very seriously. The ceremony was performed by Caleb Wright, who had been authorized as a justice of the peace. He spoke about love and commitment and the courage it takes to build a life with another person in this wild territory. Colt and Eleanor exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to stand by each other through joy and sorrow, through plenty and want, through all the days of their lives. When Colt slipped the wedding band onto Eleanor's finger beside her engagement ring, his hand was steady and his voice was strong. "I love you," he said, "today and always." "I love you," Eleanor replied, "with everything I am." They kissed as husband and wife, and the assembled crowd erupted in cheers. Ghost barked joyfully, and children threw handfuls of wildflower petals, and Colt felt a happiness so profound it was almost painful. This was his life now. This woman was his wife. This community was his home. All the years of drifting and loneliness had led him here, to this moment, to this perfect beginning. The reception lasted long into the evening. There was food and music and dancing, and everyone in Dos Rios turned out to celebrate with them. Colt danced with Eleanor under the paper lanterns, her body warm in his arms, and thought that he had never known life could be this good. They cut a cake that the women of the town had baked together, and toasted each other with apple cider, and accepted congratulations from what seemed like half the territory. As the sun set and the lanterns glowed brighter, Colt and Eleanor slipped away from the celebration and walked hand in hand to their new house. Ghost trotted ahead of them, eager to explore his new domain. They stood together on the porch and looked back toward the lights and music of the town square, and Colt pulled Eleanor close. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said. "You have given me everything I never knew I wanted, a home, a purpose, a family. You have given me yourself, and that is the greatest gift of all." They went inside, and Colt lit the lamps, filling the rooms with warm golden light. The house was simple, but solid, built to last. The bedroom held the bed the carpenter had made, covered with a quilt the women of the town had sewn as a wedding gift. The kitchen had the table Colt had commissioned, and Eleanor's few dishes arranged neatly on the shelves. The main room had a stone fireplace and comfortable chairs and windows that looked out toward the mountains. It was not much, but it was theirs, and that made it everything. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a discovery of each other without rush or reservation. Colt was gentle with Eleanor, mindful that this was new for her, and she was brave and trusting in return. They learned the language of each other's bodies, the sounds and touches that brought pleasure, the intimacy that comes from offering yourself completely to another person. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, listening to the night sounds filtering through the windows and the soft breathing of Ghost asleep on the floor beside the bed. "Thank you?" Eleanor whispered against Colt's chest. "For what?" "For taking a chance on me, for letting me into your heart even though you were afraid, for being the kind of man who would rescue a wounded dog and bring me to a town I had never heard of, and build me a house with your own hands. For being you." Colt kissed the top of her head. "You rescued me just as much as I rescued you. Maybe more. I was just going through the motions before you came along, existing, but not really living. You reminded me what it means to have something worth waking up for." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and if Colt dreamed, they were good dreams, full of sunlight and laughter, and the life they were going to build together. The first year of their marriage was marked by hard work and deep contentment. Colt took on as much work as he could find, building a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in the territory. He was fair with the animals and honest with the owners, and his skills were in high demand. The money he earned went toward improving their house and their land, buying supplies and livestock and all the things they needed to build a sustainable life. Eleanor continued teaching, though she talked increasingly about starting a family. She wanted children, wanted to fill their house with the sound of young voices and the chaos of family life. Colt wanted that too, though he was terrified in a way he could not quite articulate. The memory of Sarah's death in childbirth haunted him, and he sometimes woke in the night in a cold sweat, convinced that he was going to lose Eleanor the same way. She sensed his fear without him having to speak it aloud. One evening in early autumn, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, she took his hand and said, "You are afraid that having a baby will kill me." It was not a question. Colt squeezed her hand, but said nothing. "I am not, Sarah," Eleanor continued softly. "I am strong and healthy, and there is a good midwife in Dos Rios. I know there are no guarantees, Colt. I know that childbirth is dangerous, especially out here. But I also know that I want to build a family with you, and that means accepting the risk that come with that. Life is not safe. Love is not safe, but it is worth it." Colt looked at his wife, at the determination in her eyes and the strength in her bearing, and he knew she was right. They could not live their lives in fear of what might happen. They could only move forward with courage and faith and hope that things would work out. "All right," he said. "Let us start a family." Her smile was radiant. "Really? Really? You are right. We cannot let fear control us. And I want children too, Eleanor. I want to see you hold our baby. I want to teach our son or daughter to ride. I want to give them the kind of childhood I had, full of open spaces and hard work and love." They made love that night with a new sense of purpose, and Colt released his fear into the darkness and chose to believe in the future. And perhaps the universe rewarded that act of faith, because by Christmas, Eleanor was pregnant. The news filled Colt with equal parts joy and terror. He became protective to the point of absurdity, insisting that Eleanor stop hauling water and chopping wood, and doing any of the dozen other physically demanding tasks that came with frontier life. She tolerated his fussing for a while, then finally sat him down and explained that pregnant women had been doing hard work since the beginning of time, and she was not going to spend 9 months sitting idle. They compromised. Eleanor continued teaching through her pregnancy, but she accepted help with the heavier tasks around the house. Colt hired a teenage boy from town to chop wood and carry water, and he took on extra work to pay for it. He also built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it until the surface was silky to the touch, and Eleanor sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing for the arrival of their child with meticulous care. Ghost seemed to understand that something was changing. He became even more protective of Eleanor, following her everywhere and positioning himself between her and any perceived threats. When she sat, he lay at her feet. When she walked, he paced beside her. Colt was grateful for the dog's vigilance, knowing that Eleanor was safe even when he had to be away for work. As Eleanor's belly grew round and full, Colt found himself talking to the baby, pressing his ear against her stomach to listen for movement, marveling at the kicks and rolls that signaled life growing inside her. He told the baby stories about the ranch where he grew up, about Ghost and their adventures, about the mother who loved them already more than words could express. And sometimes, late at night when Eleanor was asleep, he whispered prayers to whatever gods might be listening, begging them to keep his wife safe, promising anything if they would just let her survive the birth. The baby came on a warm day in late July, 3 weeks earlier than the midwife had predicted. Eleanor's labor started in the morning, and by noon, the contractions were coming hard and fast. The midwife, a capable woman named Martha Jennings, arrived quickly and took charge with calm efficiency. She sent Colt out of the room, but he refused to go far, pacing the porch with Ghost at his side, listening to the sounds filtering through the window and dying 1,000 deaths with every cry of pain from his wife. The labor lasted 8 hours, and they were the longest 8 hours of Colt's life. He prayed and paced and tried not to think about Sarah, about the blood and the stillness, and the way his world had ended in a single terrible moment. He focused instead on Eleanor, on her strength and courage, on the life they had built together, and the future that waited just beyond this awful present. Finally, as the sun was setting and the sky was turning gold, he heard a new sound, a thin, wavering cry that grew stronger with each passing second. The cry of a baby, alive and healthy and real. Martha opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Brennan, and your wife is fine. Tired, but fine. Come meet your boy." Colt's legs nearly gave out with relief. He stumbled into the bedroom and found Eleanor propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but smiling. In her arms was a tiny bundle, a baby with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on the world around him. "Colt," Eleanor whispered, "come see our son." He crossed the room on shaking legs and knelt beside the bed. Eleanor placed the baby in his arms, and Colt looked down at the tiny face and felt his heart crack open in a way it never had before. This was his son, his child. A piece of himself and Eleanor combined into something new and miraculous. "He is perfect," Colt said, his voice breaking. "He is. And he looks just like you." Eleanor reached up and touched Colt's face. "We made it. We made it through, and we have our baby, and everything is going to be all right." Colt leaned forward and kissed her forehead, the baby cradled carefully between them. "I love you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to do this, for giving me this gift, for surviving and coming through whole. I do not know what I would do without you." "You will never have to find out," Eleanor said firmly. "I am not going anywhere. We have a family now, Colt. We have each other and our son and a whole life ahead of us. This is just the beginning." They named the baby James, after Colt's father. James Brennan came into the world with a healthy set of lungs and an appetite that kept Eleanor exhausted for the first few weeks. But she took to motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything else, and Colt marveled at how naturally she seemed to understand what the baby needed. Ghost was fascinated by the new arrival. He would sit beside the cradle for hours, watching over James with an intensity that was both touching and slightly unnerving. When James cried, Ghost would find Eleanor and alert her, and when the baby slept, Ghost stood guard as if protecting something precious and irreplaceable. Colt joked that they had 3 parents in the house, and Eleanor laughed and said Ghost was probably the most responsible of the 3 of them. Those first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diaper changes and the particular exhaustion that comes with caring for a newborn. But they were also filled with moments of transcendent joy. James's first smile, his first laugh, the way his tiny hand would wrap around Colt's finger and hold on with surprising strength, the feeling of holding his son while Eleanor slept, rocking slowly in the chair Colt had made, watching dawn break over the mountains, and thinking about all the mornings like this that stretched ahead. Eleanor took a break from teaching for the first year of James's life, focusing on caring for their son and their home. Colt worked as much as he could, bringing in steady money and building their savings. They talked about the future, about having more children, about expanding their house to accommodate a growing family. They made plans and dreamed dreams and lived in the kind of present that feels like a gift. When James was 14 months old, Eleanor announced that she was pregnant again. This time, Colt's fear was tempered by experience. He had seen Eleanor survive childbirth once, had watched her grow strong again, and he allowed himself to believe that lightning would not strike twice. They prepared for the new baby with excitement rather than terror, clearing out a corner of their bedroom for a second cradle and washing the tiny clothes that James had already outgrown. Their daughter was born on a snowy day in February, entering the world with a healthy cry and a full head of red hair that neither Colt nor Eleanor could quite account for. They named her Rose, and she was as different from James as night from day. Where her brother had been a calm baby, Rose was fussy and demanding. Where James had slept easily, Rose fought every nap, as if sleep were her mortal enemy. But she was also affectionate and quick to smile, and both Colt and Eleanor fell completely in love with her the moment they saw her. James was fascinated by his baby sister. He would stand beside her cradle and jabber at her in his baby language, and Rose would watch him with wide eyes as if trying to understand. Ghost divided his protective attention between both children, and the house was full of the chaos and noise and mess that comes with small children. Eleanor joked that she had no time to miss teaching because she was too busy managing her own classroom at home, but Colt could see that she was happy, that this life of family and home was everything she had hoped it would be. As the children grew, so did their family's roots in Dos Rios. Colt's reputation as a horseman grew, and he began to build a small training business, working with ranchers across the territory to break and train their stock. The income was good and steady, and they were able to expand their house, adding 2 bedrooms for the children and a proper dining room where they could host the dinners Eleanor loved to organize. Eleanor eventually returned to teaching part-time, taking over the morning classes while another teacher handled the afternoons. She loved having the best of both worlds, the intellectual stimulation of teaching and the joy of being home with her children. James and Rose thrived, growing strong and healthy in the clean air and open spaces of the Arizona high country. James inherited his father's calm demeanor and his mother's intelligence, while Rose was all fire and passion, a whirlwind of energy that kept everyone on their toes. Ghost grew older along with them, his muzzle turning gray and his movements becoming stiff, but his devotion never wavered. He still slept beside Colt and Eleanor's bed each night, still kept watch over the children, still greeted Eleanor with the same adoration he had shown from the first day they met. Colt would sometimes look at the old dog and remember that moment in the Superstition Mountains when he freed Ghost from that trap, and he would marvel at how one small act of kindness had changed the course of his entire life. Because if he had not rescued Ghost, he would not have had the dog with him in Tombstone, and if he had not had Ghost with him, he might not have noticed Eleanor being harassed by those men, and if he had not helped her, she would never have come to Dos Rios, and if she had not come to Dos Rios, Colt would still be alone, drifting through life without purpose or hope. Everything good in his life could be traced back to that decision to help an injured animal and the universe's strange way of rewarding compassion with more than anyone deserves. By the time James was 7 and Rose was 5, the family had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Colt's business was thriving, and Eleanor had returned to full-time teaching, now that both children were old enough to attend school. They were well respected in the community, known for their hard work and their generosity, and the way they always seemed to have room at their table for anyone who needed a meal. Life was not perfect. There were droughts that killed crops and sickness that swept through town, and the 100 small hardships that came with frontier living. But they faced everything together, Colt and Eleanor and their children and Ghost, a family bound by blood and choice and love. On a warm evening in June, when the desert was in bloom and the air smelled of sage and possibility, Colt and Eleanor sat on their porch and watched their children play in the yard. James was teaching Rose how to skip stones in the creek, and Ghost lay in the shade of a cottonwood tree, supervising with half-closed eyes. Eleanor's hand rested in Colt's, their fingers intertwined, and the contentment between them was palpable. "Did you ever imagine this?" Eleanor asked softly. "When you were at your lowest, did you ever think you could be this happy again?" Colt considered the question. "No," he said honestly. "After Sarah died, I thought I was done. I thought the best parts of my life were behind me, and all I could do was exist until it was my turn to go. I never imagined I would find love again, never imagined I would have children again, never imagined I would build something this good. What changed? Ghost trusted you," Colt said simply. "He trusted you when he had never trusted anyone but me, and I realized that if a wounded, frightened dog could take that leap of faith, then maybe I could too. You were special, Eleanor. You are special. And I am grateful every single day that I was brave enough to recognize that and hold on tight." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am grateful too. Grateful for you, for our children, for this life we have built. Grateful that I was foolish enough to come to Arizona territory with nothing but hope and $47. Grateful that you were the kind of man who would help a stranger in trouble. Grateful for Ghost, who brought us together and loved us both enough to bridge the gap between your fear and my faith." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. James's laughter rang out across the yard, and Rose's higher voice answered him. Ghost opened one eye, checked that all was well, and went back to sleep. And Colt thought that this, right here, was everything. This was the reward for surviving the hard times. This was the proof that life could surprise you with joy, even after breaking your heart. This was worth every moment of pain it took to get here. As full darkness fell and the stars began to appear overhead, Eleanor called the children in for bed. They protested, as children always do, but allowed themselves to be herded inside for baths and stories. Colt tucked James into bed while Eleanor handled Rose, and then they met in the hallway and shared a kiss that still held all the electricity of those first days in Tombstone. "I love you," Colt whispered against her lips. "I love you too," Eleanor replied. "Always and forever." They walked back to the porch and stood together under the stars, Ghost at their feet, the sound of their children's breathing soft through the open windows. The future stretched out before them, unknown and full of possibility, but they would face it the way they had faced everything else, together, with courage and love and the faith that good things could happen even in a hard world. And far to the south, in the Superstition Mountains where this story began, the wind whispered through the canyons and the desert bloomed under the moonlight, and the world turned on as it always had and always would, indifferent to individual joys and sorrows, but somehow, impossibly occasionally, giving broken people exactly what they needed to become, whole again. Years continued to roll by with the dependable rhythm of seasons in the Arizona high country. The children grew taller and stronger, and Colt's hair started showing threads of silver at the temples. Eleanor cut hers shorter for practicality, though Colt still loved to see it loose around her shoulders on quiet evenings at home. Ghost's muzzle turned completely white, and his steps grew slower, but his eyes remained alert and his devotion absolute. When James turned 10, Colt began teaching him the family trade in earnest. The boy had a natural gift with horses, a patience and understanding that could not be taught. He would spend hours in the corral with young colts, speaking to them in a low, calm voice that seemed to reach past their fear to something deeper. Watching his son work, Colt saw himself at that age, and he felt a profound satisfaction knowing that he was passing something important to the next generation. Rose was different, more interested in books than horses, inheriting her mother's love of learning and teaching. By the time she was 8, she was helping Eleanor with the younger students at school, reading to them and explaining difficult concepts with a clarity that belied her age. Eleanor would come home with stories of Rose's patience and creativity, and Colt would listen with pride, grateful that his daughter had found her calling so young. The family expanded their property over the years, purchasing adjacent parcels as they became available until they owned 20 acres with good water and grazing land. Colt built a proper stable and corral and established a reputation that brought clients from as far away as New Mexico Territory and California. The Brennan Ranch became known as the place to go if you had a difficult horse that needed training, and Colt's gentle methods produced results that force and violence could never achieve. Eleanor became not just a teacher, but an advocate for education throughout the region. She lobbied the territorial government for better funding, organized teacher training sessions, and worked tirelessly to ensure that every child in the area had access to quality schooling. Her efforts bore fruit, and by the mid-1880s, Dos Rios had one of the best school systems in Arizona Territory, with 3 full-time teachers and a curriculum that prepared students for everything from ranching to university. In the autumn of 1884, when James was 13 and Rose was 11, Ghost finally reached the end of his long life. He died peacefully in his sleep, curled up on his favorite spot on the porch, and they found him at dawn when Colt came out to start the morning chores. The grief was profound and unexpected in its intensity. Ghost had been with them through everything, the silent witness to their love story, and the loyal guardian of their family. His absence left a hole that seemed impossible to fill. They buried him on a hill overlooking their property, with a view of the mountains he had loved. James carved a marker from smooth river stone, etching Ghost's name and the years of his life, and Rose picked wildflowers to place on the grave. Eleanor spoke a few words about loyalty and love, and the debt they owed to an animal who had brought them together, and Colt stood silent, tears streaming down his face, mourning the loss of a friend who had saved him in more ways than one. "We should get another dog," Rose suggested a few weeks later. "Ghost would not want us to be sad forever." "You are right," Eleanor agreed, "but not just yet. We need time to remember him properly first." Time did what time always does, dulling the sharp edges of grief until the memories brought more smiles than tears. They would talk about Ghost often, telling the children stories of how he had never trusted anyone until he met Eleanor, how he had known she was special before Colt fully understood it himself. The story became part of their family mythology, the founding legend that explained how they came to be. When James was 15, he started courting a girl from town, the daughter of the blacksmith. Her name was Anna, and she was a sensible girl with a quick laugh and capable hands. Colt and Eleanor liked her immediately, and they watched with bittersweet pride as their son began to build relationships outside the family circle. It was evidence that they had raised him right, that he was becoming the kind of man who could love and be loved in return. Rose showed no interest in boys, much to Colt's relief. She was consumed by her studies and her work at the school, already talking about attending normal school and becoming a certified teacher like her mother. Eleanor encouraged her ambitions, and they began making plans for Rose to travel to Phoenix for advanced education when she was old enough. In 1886, Arizona Territory began the long process of applying for statehood. There were rallies and debates, and the citizens of Dos Rios found themselves caught up in the excitement of potentially becoming part of something larger. Eleanor threw herself into the cause, organizing events and writing letters to politicians, and Colt supported her efforts even though his own interest in politics was minimal. He cared about the land and his family and the life they had built, and he figured that would remain true whether they were a territory or a state. James married Anna in the spring of 1889, a joyful ceremony that reminded Colt of his own wedding all those years ago. The young couple moved into a small house on the edge of the Brennan property, and James continued to work alongside his father, learning every aspect of the horse training business. Within a year, Anna was pregnant, and the prospect of becoming grandparents filled Colt and Eleanor with a joy they had not anticipated. Their first grandchild, a boy named Thomas, was born in January of 1890. Colt held his grandson for the first time and felt the same overwhelming love he had experienced with his own children, perhaps even more intense for being unexpected. This was continuity, proof that their family would extend beyond themselves, that the life they had built would carry forward into future generations. Rose left for Phoenix that same year, 16 years old and blazingly intelligent, determined to become the best teacher the territory had ever seen. Eleanor cried when they put her on the stage, and Colt held his wife close, understanding that this was both loss and triumph. They had raised their daughter to be independent and ambitious, and now they had to let her fly. It was the natural order of things, but that did not make it easy. The house felt empty with both children gone, but Colt and Eleanor rediscovered the pleasure of being just the two of them. They took long walks in the evenings, rode out to their favorite spots in the mountains, and talked about all the things that had been pushed aside during the busy years of raising children. They were in their early 40s now, still healthy and active, with decades potentially ahead of them. The prospect was both exciting and daunting. "What do you want to do with the rest of our lives?" Eleanor asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. Colt considered the question. "More of this," he said finally. "More time with you, more work with the horses, more moments like this where we can just be together without rushing to the next thing. Maybe some travel, if you are interested. I have always wanted to see the ocean." Eleanor smiled. "I would love that. We could visit Rose in Phoenix and James and Anna here. We could see some of the country beyond Arizona. We could take all those dreams we had when we were young and actually live them now that we have the time and resources." So they did. Over the next several years, Colt and Eleanor traveled throughout the Southwest, taking trips to California to see the Pacific Ocean, visiting Santa Fe and Denver and San Antonio. They saw ancient cliff dwellings and modern cities, rode trains through mountain passes, and stayed in hotels that would have seemed impossibly luxurious to their younger selves. But they always came home to Dos Rios, to their house and their land and the family that continued to grow. James and Anna had 3 more children, giving Colt and Eleanor a total of 4 grandchildren to spoil and love. Rose graduated from normal school at the top of her class and returned to Dos Rios to take over as head teacher, implementing innovative methods she had learned in Phoenix and earning respect throughout the territory. She eventually married a fellow teacher named David, and they had 2 children of their own, adding to the expanding family tree. In 1895, Colt turned 50 years old. It felt impossible, like someone had stolen entire decades when he was not paying attention. But when he looked at his life, at Eleanor still beautiful beside him, at the family they had created and the legacy they were building, he could not find it in himself to mourn the passage of time. Every gray hair and wrinkle was earned through years of love and work and purpose. They held a large celebration for Colt's birthday, inviting family and friends from across the territory. The house and yard filled with people, and there was music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Colt stood on his porch and looked out at the crowd, at his children and grandchildren, at neighbors who had become friends and friends who had become family, and he felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Eleanor found him there, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking about a scared dog caught in a trap," Colt said softly. "I am thinking about a woman who stood up to 3 men even though she was terrified. I am thinking about all the small choices and accidents and moments of grace that led us here. And I am thinking that I would not change a single thing, because it all led to this." "To us," Eleanor added. "To us," Colt agreed. "To our family and our life and every moment we have been given. I was so lost when you found me, Eleanor. I was just going through the motions, waiting to die. And you reminded me what it meant to be alive. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Eleanor corrected gently. "That is what love is, Colt. Not one person rescuing another, but 2 people choosing each other and building something together that neither could create alone. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Colt pulled Eleanor close and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness of their first kiss in Tombstone all those years ago. Some things changed with time, but this had not. The love between them remained constant, the foundation on which everything else was built. The years continued their relentless march forward. Arizona finally achieved statehood in 1912, and Eleanor lived long enough to vote in her first election as a citizen of a full state rather than a territory. She was 70 years old by then, her dark hair turned silver, and her face lined with the marks of a life well lived, but her green eyes still sparkled with intelligence and humor. Colt was 76, his body worn down by decades of physical labor, but his spirit still strong. They had slowed down considerably, spending most of their time at home now, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. James had taken over the horse training business entirely, and he ran it with the same skill and integrity his father had demonstrated. Rose had retired from teaching, but remained active in the community, mentoring young teachers and advocating for educational reform. On a warm evening in June of 1914, Colt and Eleanor sat on their porch, as they had done thousands of times before. They were holding hands as they always did, and watching the sun set behind the mountains. Their great-grandson, a toddler named after Colt, played in the yard under the watchful eye of his mother. "Do you remember the first time we sat here?" Eleanor asked softly. "Before the house was even finished, when it was just us and Ghost and a whole future stretching ahead." "I remember everything," Colt replied. "Every moment with you is carved into my heart. We have had a good life, have we not? The best, better than I ever deserved." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "You deserve every bit of happiness we found together. You are a good man, Colt Brennan, the best man I have ever known." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead. The air was warm and sweet, carrying the scent of the desert in bloom. From inside the house came the sound of voices and laughter, the family gathering for dinner as they did every Sunday. This was their legacy, Colt thought. Not the land or the house or the business, but the people, the family they had created and nurtured and launched into the world. Eleanor's hand relaxed in his, and Colt looked over to find that she had fallen asleep, her head tilted back against the rocking chair. He smiled and let her rest, content to sit in the darkness and listen to the sounds of their family, to feel the warmth of her hand in his, to exist in this perfect moment for as long as it lasted. She never woke up. Sometime during that peaceful hour on the porch, surrounded by the family she loved and the land she had made her own, Eleanor Bishop Brennan slipped quietly from sleep into death, her heart simply stopping after 82 years of beating strong and true. Colt knew the moment she was gone, felt the absence like a physical wound. He held her hand and cried silent tears and whispered his love and his gratitude for all the years they had been given. And when the family finally came to call them to dinner and found them there, Colt still holding Eleanor's hand, they understood that something precious had been lost. They buried Eleanor on the hill where Ghost lay, with a view of the mountains and the land she had loved. The entire town turned out for the funeral, and people came from across the state to pay their respects to a woman who had touched so many lives. Rose spoke about her mother's dedication to education and her fierce love of family. James talked about her courage and her kindness and the way she had made everyone feel welcome at her table. And Colt stood silent, his grief too profound for words, knowing that a part of himself had gone into that grave along with his wife. He lived for 3 more years, long enough to see Rose's daughter graduate from college, long enough to hold his first great-great-grandchild, long enough to know that the family he and Eleanor had built was strong enough to continue without them. But the light had gone out of his eyes, and everyone could see that he was just marking time until he could be reunited with the woman he had loved for nearly 40 years. He died on a morning in late summer, sitting in his rocking chair on the porch with a view of Eleanor's grave on the hill. James found him there, at peace, a slight smile on his weathered face, as if he had seen something wonderful in his final moments. They buried him beside Eleanor, and carved both their names on a single stone, along with the dates of their births and deaths, and a simple inscription, "Together, always." The family gathered after the funeral, 3 generations strong, and they told stories about Colt and Eleanor. They talked about the cowboy and the teacher, about the dog that brought them together, about the life they had built from nothing but love and determination and faith in each other. And as the sun set behind the mountains and the stars began to appear overhead, the family raised glasses in a toast to the couple who had started it all. "To Colt and Eleanor," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "May we all be lucky enough to find a love like theirs." "To Colt and Eleanor," the family chorused, and they drank deeply, honoring the memory of two people who had proven that, even in the hardest of times, in the wildest of places, love could not only survive, but flourish. The years continued to pass, as years do. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, along with the stories of how it all began. Great-grandchildren who never met Colt and Eleanor grew up hearing about them, learning the lessons they had embodied about courage and kindness, and the importance of being open to love even when you are afraid. The house was eventually expanded and modernized, but the original rooms remained intact, preserved as a testament to simpler times. The porch where Colt and Eleanor had spent so many evenings was maintained with care, the rocking chairs replaced when they wore out but always present, always waiting for someone to sit and watch the sunset and remember. On the hill overlooking the property, 3 graves stood together, Ghost's simple river stone marker and the shared headstone of Colt and Eleanor Brennan. Wildflowers grew there in profusion, planted by family members over the decades and now self-seeding year after year. It became a place of pilgrimage for the family, a spot to visit when they needed perspective or comfort, or a reminder of where they came from. And sometimes, on warm evenings when the air was full of the scent of sage and the stars were brilliant overhead, people claimed they could see shadows on that porch. 2 figures sitting side by side, holding hands, watching the sunset together. And a third shadow, smaller, sitting at their feet with the patient devotion of a dog that had finally found his home. The story of Colt and Eleanor became legend in Dos Rios, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. The cowboy who rescued a wounded dog, the teacher who came west with nothing but hope, the animal that trusted no one until he met the woman who would save his master's life by giving him a reason to live again. It was a love story, yes, but it was also a story about healing and second chances and the unexpected ways that grace enters our lives if we are brave enough to accept it. And in the end, that was the legacy they left. Not just the family and the ranch and the successful business, but the reminder that we are all capable of transformation, that wounds can heal, that trust can be rebuilt, that love can find us even in our darkest moments if we have the courage to let it in. That one small act of kindness can ripple outward in ways we can never predict or control, changing lives and building futures and creating something beautiful out of pain. The Wild West where they lived and loved has long since passed into history. The rough frontier towns civilized and modernized beyond recognition. But the story remains, a testament to a time and place where life was hard but love endured, where people built lives with their own hands and found joy in simple things, where a man and a woman and a dog created something lasting out of the raw material of second chances. And that, in the end, is everything. The proof that we are more than our wounds, more than our fears, more than the sum of our losses. We are capable of extraordinary things when we choose love over safety, connection over isolation, hope over despair. Colt and Eleanor understood that, lived it every day of their lives together, and left behind not just descendants but a legacy of courage that continues to inspire long after they are gone. Their story ends not with death, but with continuation, with the family that keeps growing, with the love that keeps being passed down, with the lesson that keeps being learned and relearned by each new generation. That is immortality, not in the body, but in the impact we have on the world and the people in it. And by that measure, Colt Brennan and Eleanor Bishop live forever, their love story echoing through time, a reminder that even in the wildest of places, even in the hardest of times, the human heart remains capable of extraordinary things. The end of their story is really just the beginning of countless others, each one building on the foundation they laid, each one proving again that love is worth the risk, that trust is worth extending, that opening your heart is worth the pain that might follow. Because without that risk, without that trust, without that open heart, we miss out on everything that makes life worth living. And Ghost knew that from the beginning. The wounded dog who had every reason never to trust again looked at Eleanor Bishop and saw something worth believing in. And in that moment of recognition, in that simple act of trust, he gave his master the greatest gift possible. He showed him that it was safe to love again, that second chances were real, that the future could be brighter than the past. That is the real magic of the story, the part that resonates across the decades and the distance. Not that they fell in love, though that was wonderful. Not that they built a successful life, though that was impressive, but that they were both brave enough to try, to take the leap, to trust in something as fragile and powerful as the human connection. And in doing so, they created not just a life, but a legacy. Not just a family, but a lesson. Not just a love story, but a reminder that we are all capable of more than we think if we just have the courage to let someone in. The Arizona sky stretches endless and blue above the graves on that hill, the same sky that watched over Colt and Eleanor for all their years together. The mountains stand eternal in the distance, unchanged by the passage of time and the turning of generations. And the wind carries the scent of sage and desert flowers, whispering stories of the past to anyone willing to listen. This is where it ends and begins, in the high country of Arizona, where a cowboy and a teacher and a dog created something that would outlast them all. This is the legacy of trust and love and second chances. This is the proof that even broken things can be made whole again if we are patient and brave and willing to believe that better days are possible. This is the story of Colt and Eleanor, and it is complete.